So Ray is one of the senior people over here. He's an honorary professor at the Institute of Women Health. No, it's not. It's a honor to be senior, no? I think. We know. That's what I was told. In the University College London, is a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology and is a biologist writing extensively about biological theory, philosophy, and working in how organisms sense and engage with their environment. I'm not going to follow all his career for the lack of time, but one thing that I think is important to note is that he's now published a book with his brother, and it's called Understanding Living Systems. That's the book that you have over here. So he will show you more about it. And I think that he will introduce the idea of this book and other ideas that I find very interesting into this discussion. So he will have, each one of the facilitator will have 20 minutes, and we invite him over here. So welcome, Ray. I will just put this on you, I think.
Yes, you can do that.
If I will know how to do it.
Whatever happens, where it goes.
Yeah. So I hope, I think it's like this, right? Perfect. No.
Okay, that's good.
Great.
First, thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I think facilitate is an excellent idea.
Ignore me. This is a tech conversation.
Oh, I see. Okay, fair enough. That's good. That's an interesting phenomenon. Now, there are two key points that I really want to make that I hope we can take in the discussion. First of all, it is that living things, by their very nature, harness change, harness variability, to be creative in change. I want to say a little bit about that. And the other point that I want to make is that they do so in an intimate, nested functionality. Some of you may, of course, be familiar with these kinds of concepts about nesting from the studies of Whitehead and so on. I think that these two concepts are vital in understanding what I consider to be a transformation in our understanding of living systems from a hard mechanistic view of living systems to a more general idea, a holistic idea of the way life functions. So these are the two things I want to do. I want to start by looking at a group discussion. Can you move the slide on, please? Do you want me to control that?
No, I will do it.
Now, cogitation, action, learning, observation, even love and affection, emotion. These chimpanzees are cracking nuts, and they're doing so with a tool of their creation. That tool is relatively simple, but then, our tool making started off very simple as well. They're using a stone to crack nuts. There's something very interesting about this, which is that not all chimpanzee groups do this. It has, as it were, to be introduced into the group, either by a member of the group or by somebody being mischievous and introducing it to the group. And then it gets passed on to others in the group. And it isn't just simply copying for the sake of copying. It involves cogitation. It involves understanding. It involves anticipation of the outcome. It involves decisions, choice, about what makes the best kind of stone. And in the process of doing that, they will hone the stone. They will change it, make it more suited, because they get to know and understand what it is that makes a stone more effective at cracking nuts. Anticipation is a key. Imagination is another, because that's really, to a large extent, what the anticipation is doing. It's imagining the outcome, both based on experience and observation. And this is crucial to the way we think about the world about us. It's also transgenerational. It gets passed on. You see, we don't pass on simply our genes in order to have function in life. In fact, the genes are not the great blueprint of life that they're often claimed to be. This notion of genes as a blueprint has become so culturally embedded that we use it without thinking, unlike the chimpanzees with their stones. We say things like, it's in their genes. No, it is not. In relation to our function and the function of these chimpanzees and the function of all living organisms, the genes are in the organism and are used as tools by the organism to achieve what they do. And the genes do not intercede. They don't intervene in anything we do in the moment. Please believe me, honestly, they don't. They cannot control us body and mind because they cannot control our mind. They cannot. They have no facility to do so. They are not swarming within us. These are quotations, incidentally. That one, swarming within us, controlling us body and mind, is from Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. You cannot be selfish unless you have the option not to be. That is a crucial fundamental of understanding the way in which organisms use genes in moulding their action, creating and being creative in their ecological and social context. Now, unfortunately, for the last 70 to 80 years, biological thinking got locked into a reductive mindset. Now, if I could have the next slide, please. Sorry, I'm going to come back to that. I'll come back to that. It's a bit complicated. Let's go on to the next one. Sorry. Now, look at this, you see. Now, this is a simple relationship between a protein. Don't worry about that. I'm not going to talk about biophysics. But there's an interesting thing about this. There's a protein channel inside the membrane of a cell, any cell. And these channels inside the membrane control flux of ions. I told you I wasn't going to talk about biophysics. The flux of ions across, in and out of the membrane. In fact, they're involved in generating a voltage difference between the inside, and that's all you have to know, and the outside. And that is crucial, cell voltage, in the functionality of the cell, in all sorts of different kinds of ways. So this is a key ingredient of the function of cells. But when you look at this, there are two things when I look at this. First, I can't see the chimpanzees cracking nuts, you see. And yet I know that when the chimpanzee is cracking nuts, their cells will be doing something like this, and a lot more. But I can't reduce the process of chimpanzees cracking nuts and culturally engaging with each other, writing books about it, perhaps, if they're our kind of chimpanzee, humans, and telling future generations about it, or getting a greater understanding of it. Even though genes, of course, produce these proteins. They do. They produce. That's one crucial thing that they do. Now, if I could go back again to that slide before this. Very strangely, and you may be surprised by this, a dogma has held sway in biology for almost 100 years, that first of all, changes in structure and function in one generation cannot pass through the germline. It's untrue. It really is untrue. You can look at the literature that we show in our little book, Understanding Living Systems, and you'll see why that's not true. Organisms cannot alter its genes, and that the causation is one way. That you see genes produce proteins which produce function, and therefore all function is reducible to genes. It's nonsense. And in any event, we can change our genes. We control our genes epigenetically. We decide, organisms decide which genes are functional, which genes are not. It marks those genes that are functional and being used. It has a way of knowing in what context those genes have and are being used. It was thought that all that system information in one generation, somehow or another, during the process of reproduction, got wiped clean. It's a bit like giving somebody a computer and wiping it free of any kind of software whatsoever that's been developed and saying, here you are, here's a lovely computer. You can go and function with it. And you open it up and you find it's got no software. It's got nothing in there that makes it function at all, really. Just the hardware. And, but it's wrong, you see. We alter our genes all the time in both the process of function and action, and also those changes, many of them, not all of them, some of them do get wiped clean, but many of them get passed on through the germline to the next generation. There's another way in which information, which I've referred to already, gets transferred across generations, which of course is culturally. And
halfway.
Thank you. Very useful. So it's absolutely vital that, in terms of human beings, of course, I mean, just in a very short space of time, just a few thousand of years, we've reached this. Here we are sitting, talking about abstract concepts, understanding, learning, and wanting to further learn. This is a fundamental part of our behavior. It's not in our genes. You do not find these ideas in our genes. There's not a gene for the idea that there's a nested functionality. The next slide beyond the one that I have, please. Now, you can of course see that DNA produces RNA, which produces protein. But all this is part and controlled by a very complex set of network functionality. And if I have my next slide. And this is all nested. So the influences on this functionality go in all different directions. There isn't just simply a clear one-way process from gene through to behavior or gene through to action. What we get is, in this diagram, we've got the organelles and cellular networks, that's within the cell. And these are constrained by the membrane and neighbouring cells cells, which form tissues. And tissues influence each other. The cells and the tissues influence each other in organ systems. They do so in a whole variety of different kinds of ways, by producing hormones, for example, or factors that influence neighbouring cells. We call these constraints. In fact, when you read the use of the word boundary condition or constraint in our book, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about these functional influences. Boundaries are functional, and they're also open systems. And then finally to the organism. But it extends beyond that, this concept. If we go to the next slide, because you can see the organism also does this in relation to family, to social groups. Interspecies interactions. We live in complex ecosystems. We live in systems where we cooperate with other organisms, different organisms from different species, even from different orders, will cooperate with each other. It's not all about killing each other, although yes, that happens, there's predator and prey and so on, there's defensive action and so on, and so on. It all requires, and you can see that this is nested and intimate in its relationship in what we refer to as the ecosystem, and then of course with nature as a whole. The air that we breathe is produced by this. The air that we sustain ourselves with, the oxygen levels have been created largely by life, that facilitates life. It's like somebody took, we referred to pottery and so on, with lumps of clay. It's as if at some point a lump of clay mixed with water was thrown on a wheel and it turned. And these forces, these intimate interrelationships, are the hands that mould it, the boundary condition. And it can only mould it because it's moving. It can only mould it because it's active. Like the molecules in the air in this room, they're bouncing around. And it's harnessing that kinetics, that energy that produces change. And organisms can harness it in creative ways. My next slide, I think, which will, bring us to the end of my suggestions, my main points. In this intimate relationship of the organism and its environment, the ecosystem, we must always remember that it's not isolated. You don't. The worst thing is to take organisms and study them in isolation. The early behaviorists started doing this. It's like treating organisms as machines, and you can take them away from this intimacy and somehow or other understand their behavior. And then you start forcing them to do things like press buttons in order to get food and water and so on. Well, of course, if you were stuck in a box and you discovered, even if accidentally, that you only got fed or got water if you accidentally pressed this lever, you might consider, wow, I better start pressing this lever. I mean, this is not, it's only a very tiny part of understanding the intimate relationship that occurs between organisms in an ecosystem. But in order to operate in this, if I can have my next slide, we need intelligence.
This is the next one?
Organisms need intelligence about the intimacy of the environment they're in. What other organisms exist within their immediate vicinity? What do they do? Where do they do it? When do they do it? And here's one final question. Why do they do it? You see, because that is a vital question. And that question, why, has on the whole been parked by science. Because science, in its mechanistic way, has tended to look at how and when and where, because they can be measured. Why is tricky. I'll tell you why it's tricky in just my last sentence. Now, when you see a chimpanzee pick up a stone, you might think that it's picking up the stone because it is going to crack nuts. But you might be wrong, and he might be picking it up in order to crack heads. Thank you.
Okay.
Is that better? Yeah.
Let's take the microphone.
Oh, yes. Do you want to do this? Yeah. No. Oh, you don't have to do it.
And we will move directly to our next speaker so that we will have time. The next speaker is Peter Sloot. He's trained as a chemical physicist and he did his PhD at the Netherlands Cancer Institute. and is a professor of a complex adaptive system of the University of Amsterdam. Now, again, I mean, he's one of the people that interdisciplinary is his second name. I mean, he has a background in physics, in computational science, in computer science, in complex system, and in many other disciplines. He has published over 500 articles in his career, which is quite amazing, and I don't understand how anybody can reach these kind of things. And he lately got a mega grant, which is something like 3.6 million euro. This is the highest grant, personal grant existing. So we are very lucky to have him over here with us. And he also lately established a company which is called Applied Complexity, which is assist other companies and NGOs to use complexity in their challenges that they are trying to address. So I hope that I cover all his achievement or part of it. And we are very happy to have him over here. And he will again talk about complexity over here and the connection between complexity and plasticity. So, of course.
So this Center for Unusual Calculations, such a funny name. I can get used to it. I'll be talking about complexity and plasticity, and share with you some thoughts there. Let me first make this statement that all complex systems show plasticity, and I'll just pose that my hypothesis and go on from that. But what is a complex system? There are many different definitions of that, and everybody has his own favorite one, and these are my two favorite ones. If it's complex, it's not simple. And that means that it's basically not reducible to its elements, and actually the previous speaker already mentioned that. Because the moment you reduce it to its elements, you actually lose what you're looking for. You lose the characteristics of the system that makes it complex. Another way to look at this, it's like a set of interacting elements, nonlinear interaction often, that adapt to the environment that they create themselves, which I find a very beautiful way of looking at it. Like the flock of starlings here, starlings, the flock of starlings that they create an environment, it is kind of beautiful wave, and they react to that environment themselves. So it's a very set of feedback loops going on there. So they interact with each other, nonlinear, create an environment and react to that environment, and then it goes on like that. By the way, these two are examples, so that one of course is the bird flock, and the other one was about the immune system, which is one of the things that I'm working on. They are everywhere complex systems. These are just a set of examples. And these definitions that we're giving you, they apply to all these elements. Whether we talk about cities, we talk about ecosystems, obviously, but also the markets and even the Internet of Things is a set of interactions, non-linear, creating an environment in which people, things interact themselves again. So, and they have a function, not particularly one that you design, because the function actually emerges out of the interactions that they have. And what do I mean with that? So we are all, at this moment, we are all producing thoughts, right? So our brain is doing things, neurons firing, etc., etc. And you can ask yourself, how much of a thought is there in one neuron? Which is like a silly question, right? Because we all agree that there is not just one neuron creating it. So, okay, so how much of a thought is there in 1,000 neurons, in 100,000, in millions? At what point in time can I say there is a thought? So what is this transition that goes from the individual to the collective? And just to give it away, we don't know. But this is an important question. And I was lucky to work for some time with Murray Kalman, And he posed it like this. He said, well, how wet is one molecule of water? And it's the same silly question, right? Because wetness, if you like, is not a function of an individual atom or molecule, but it's a collective. And at what point does that collective produce this wetness? We don't know. But we know that there is a transition, that it's happening somewhere. And I can take out one molecule, or I can take out a couple of neurons and I still produce thoughts. At what point? We don't know. But that's the concept of emergence. And one of the things we find in complex system studies is that we can quite often describe them pretty well, the dynamics of the complex systems, pretty well by networks. And whether we are talking about metabolic networks, or we talk about the work that we did ourselves, this is HIV proteins in interacting with the immune system, or you talk about networks within companies, or you talk about social networks like opinion networks, etc. All those networks exhibit emergent properties, and all those networks are in principle a good description of the complexity that these systems exploit. I'll skip this one. This is actually just a social network, the high school dating network, just for your fun. Think about it. I'm not going to talk about it. But the important thing, this is a really important thing, what we discovered, we as computer scientists, not myself, is that those networks, if you look at the connections, so like here you see, the blue ones are the boys and the red ones are the girls, and there you see a very happy boy there, you see the blue one, let me point it at you, this one over here, right? So, so that one has a lot of connections, so to say, right? And there are, more isolated ones here. And so if I look at the number of connections, what I expect, like everything in biology, there would be like a normal distribution, some kind of Gaussian distribution. So this is what I would expect, the number of connections. There are just a few with few connections, a few with a lot of connections, and in between somewhere there will be the average connections of that network, which is totally, utterly wrong. It's not what it is. It's like this. So all those networks, where we talk about gene regulatory networks, protein networks, social networks, all those networks have this characteristic, so-called power laws. And it basically means that, so there are a lot with a few connections, and there are a few with a lot of connections. Right? We see that in all those networks that exhibit this complexity characteristics that I'm talking about. And this is crucial. So the consequence is, if you look at this, these things don't have an average, right? So that thing has an average, but what we find is this, and this doesn't have an average. And it has an infinite variance. So that creates problems for us, because we always work with averages. Like, so all the machine learning stuff, all the AI, all the data science will basically not really work very nice on this, because there is no average. How can you learn against something that doesn't have an average, that moves around while you're looking at it, so to say? So having more data will also introduce more exceptions, and it doesn't help you to make the algorithms converge. One of the questions we asked ourselves is, how robust are these networks? Which is basically the question, how robust is this complex system? Which is basically the question, how robust is this plasticity? Because as I said, every complex system shows plasticity. So to study plasticity, we could study networks, at least these type of networks. Right? So the networks that have these power laws. So that's what we did. And here's just a little animation of that. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get information. This could be, signal transduction within biological networks, but it could also be just a message going across a social network. It could be in opinions, going through networks, whatever. As long as these networks are, like I said, power laws. So we try to send a message across, and what we see is that if we disturb this, if we create mistakes in the network, so to say, if we take out nodes, or we rewire a node, so we create noise, so to say, then actually the network, the information progress gets better for some time, which is, well, if you think of it, pretty complicated. It's related to a physical thing which is called stochastic resonance, a physics thing. But the bottom line is, you want to send a message from one side to another side, You disturb it, and it actually gets better in doing it. Until you disturb too much, and then the whole thing will collapse. So this is for me in the signature experiment telling me something about plasticity of complex systems. And there's a deeper thing in that, which I cannot go into, but the bottom line is that if you keep on disturbing a system, a complex system, it tries to recover, you do it again, it recovers, and then if you would measure the time that it takes to recover, you would see that that diverges, and at some point it will actually tell you where the tipping point will be, the moment that it cannot recover anymore, that the plasticity is gone. It's broken, the thing is kapot. So that's what I'm saying here, it has its limits. So we like to think of complex systems like biological systems, like life, like ecosystems, like whatever, that they kind of exist between complete order and complete disorder. And that's the way we like to think about these things. And that's important from a more, I would say, philosophical point of view. You know, the second law of thermodynamics tells us everything will become chaos at some point. So how can it be that we are here? How can it be that there are still these little pockets of order in a system that's constantly driving to complete disorder? And the general thought now is that life, and I would say complex systems, they actually try to create a little bit of structure while being in this kind of chaotic environment by doing what we call the dissipation of that entropy. So that's what's happening. Complex systems operate at the edge of chaos. And that leads to these critical transitions that I was talking about. The fact that they are there means that they are sensitive to this not being able anymore to recover. So this limit of plasticity is the fact, it's a consequence of being on this edge of chaos, if you like. So one of the complex systems, of course, is our brain, doing all those beautiful, wonderful, remarkable things, integrating all kinds of sensory information, things like we see, we smell, we touch, we taste, we hear, and all that stuff is integrated. And some thought is, if you look at the way signals are going through the brain, some of the recent thoughts is that it might be that the brain is operating exactly at this kind of critical transition, if you like, at this critical point. So it's not completely organized, not completely disorganized, it sits somewhere in between. And that means if one neuron fires, it doesn't fire a billion at the same time, but a limited amount that then propagates. So that's again this feeling between completely order and disorder. So the question, how does this pan out? I'm almost done. How does this pan out for plasticity in the greater view of things? So with these 8 to 100 billion neurons that we have in our brain, and each neuron have about 10,000 connections, with 10 to the power 15 synaptic connections. The thing is that can we always adapt to this environment that we're in? So we see like species can adapt and adapt for some time, but the question is, at what point does that stop? Or is there a price to pay? Or, so it can still survive, but it comes at a price. Well, one way to think about that is look like this. So, you know, as hunter-gatherers, our combined physiological and social metabolic rate was something like 300 watts. Now, being city dwellers, we spend about 11,000 watts. And look at this, right? I find it such a cool picture. So, you know, looking on this device, which is incredibly complex, navigating the environment, which is incredibly complex, staying alive somehow, it's wild. So yeah, we have adapted. We are able to do these things, which is completely remarkable. But the question is there a price? Is there a limit to that plasticity that is shown? And so here in the University of Amsterdam, there is a project we started. It's called Urban Mental Health, and that's looking at the relation between being a city dweller and your mental health. And actually we do find that living in cities gives a stronger indication of having mental disorders, where mental disorders can also be, addiction, but also things like depression. So there seems to be some kind of, what you see, the data is very messy. There seems to be some kind of relation between being a city dweller, living in a very dense city environment and your mental health. And so what we're thinking now is that the price that we pay for living in this very complicated environment and surviving in these very complicated environments, the price that we pay for that might be the price of some kind of mental problems. And this is, as far as I know, very much uncharted territory in terms of, let's say, reproducible mechanistic scientific methods for that. So it's very hard to look at that. But this might be the reason why we're facing these massive consequences, large questions in the world, how things like inequality to some point is acceptable and then it doesn't become acceptable anymore, because then people start to react to that and the thing will collapse. The geopolitical stresses, the complexity that goes with the spreading of diseases, all these things are reflections of a complex system under tremendous stress, trying to recover and find pathways out of it. And the question is, will we find? I don't know. So this sounds a bit negative, so let me end with a positive note. We do have now, I think, we have the beginning of a scientific method in using these methods and tools from complexity science to study the things like plasticity in a more quantitative way. But it's still a very, very, very long way to go, because you have to integrate all those disciplines. You have to look at what the psychologists and the sociologists are doing, and what the biologists are doing, what the physicists are doing. You have to somehow integrate all that into something that makes sense, where you can do important measurements to figure this out. And that's my contribution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We will still need you, of course, for the not now, for the discussion later. I would like now to invite our next contributor to this discussion, and after that, everything will be open for all of us. So just let me find his introduction. So the next contributor is Igor Banci. He's a leader center of the Behavioral and Science and Mental Health in the Italian Institute of Health. So this connects nice to what Peter was just talking about in Rome, in Italy. And he's a visiting professor of behavioral biology at the University of Rome. Was the past president of the European Brain and Behavior Society, and his main research interest is in the application of integrative approach from epigenetic to behavioral and given environment to understand psychiatric disorders and all kinds of therapeutic strategies. He's interested in complexity, in philosophical consideration about the effectiveness of science approach, and he's also studied stress and the connection between drug and environment, and he's also looking a lot about clinical investigation and about developing mathematical model to measure plasticity. So I'm very happy to have him here because during this 2 years that our group is working on it, I stumbled about one of his articles, and this is why we wanted to invite him over here. And I could say that I've learned so much from what he wrote, so I'm very happy that he's with us. Do you want to put a PowerPoint or not?
Yes, it's already on.
Oh, okay, that was busted. So let's put this microphone on you. And
No, it's not working.
It's
So
It's
just
on.
use the desk mic,
okay.
and then this camera also has a mic, and that's for audience audio.
I think it doesn't work because I didn't operate it.
It's fine now, we're good now.
Okay,
Okay.
great.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for this event that sounded immediately to me so interesting and so much on the topic that I am interested in. So I'm very happy to be here. So I thank very much Esme and Yaron for the organization of all this. Okay, I've been asked to react to the first two talks. So I organized some slides while the first two speakers, Ray Noble and Peter Sloot, were speaking. So I'm sorry if these are not fantastic. I try to do my best. So I'm a neuroscientist and I work in the field of mental health. And my main focus is plasticity. And as a neuroscientist, I face so many types of plasticity in my experience. And for instance, we have heard about synaptic plasticity, morphological plasticity, whatever. Metaplasticity is how plastic plasticity is. So there are a lot of definitions of plasticity. So in order to study plasticity, what we do is, first of all, define what plasticity is. And in order to keep it simple, plasticity in our hands is the following. It's not a scientific text, does not come from a scientific text, but from the Oxford Dictionary. So a very broad definition. And plasticity is just the quality of being easily shaped or molded. So, and this is also, this is very translational concept. I can measure plasticity for this table. I can apply force and see how much it bends in a given amount of time. But I can do the same with patients. I apply stress or I apply a supportive environment. I measure how much they change their behavioral outcome, their mental state in a given amount of time. So it's a very general concept. But in order to better understand what plasticity is in our hands, according to our view, it's important to consider also it in a causality perspective, because when we talk about causality in complex systems, we have to consider different types of causality. The most common one is what we have named instructive causality. When we usually refer to causality, we refer to instructive causality. That is an event that produces an outcome, such as a billiard ball that hits another balls, and the consequences of this hit are defined by the features of the first ball. So the second ball will change his speed, direction, according to the features of the first ball. But there is also another type of causality, and this is a causality that we named permissive causality. This permissive causality is when an event has nothing to do with the outcome, but can affect its likelihood to occur. So it can stop, enable it, or slow down, speed up, whatever, but does not affect the shape of the outcome, that affect only the likelihood of its occurrence. So this is what is plasticity for us. And the analogy we use to talk about plasticity is the analogy of the doors. So plasticity is not good, it's not bad, it's just having the opportunity to change. Changing, for instance, is going out from this room and go in the corridor here. This is an opportunity to change, and the door that is open now allow us to do this. So we are plastic in this sense, but even if the door is open now, we are not going out of the room. So plasticity does not imply an outcome, but plasticity allows us to achieve a specific outcome. This is what plasticity is in our studies. And this also is linked to the idea that plasticity is not beneficial or detrimental. So when we study mental health and plasticity, we consider that plasticity is key because it's what allows patients to switch from depressive condition, we study mainly depression, with depressive condition to a healthy condition, to well-being. And so plasticity is when, in this case, there is no plasticity because it's not possible to switching to have the door open. In this case, plasticity is there. But what is important is that if plasticity is there, you can go from depression to a healthy condition, but also the other way around. Okay, so plasticity is not good again. Okay, so what we did to show that, very briefly, what we have shown, for instance, this is a study that we have done in a large clinical trial, in which we measure plasticity. There are some drugs that affect plasticity, for instance, antidepressants. Antidepressants do affect plasticity, okay, and our idea is that if they affect plasticity, they amplify the effect of the environment. They allow the environment to change you more. So the idea is that if this is a very schematic presentation, the square here is the patient, and the color inside the square is the mood. And if we have two different environments, if a patient is in a adverse environment, is affected by the adverse environment, the same in a favorable environment. But if we treat them with drugs that enhance plasticity, then we have a higher match, a larger match between the mood of the patient and the environment in which they live. And if we have different dosages of the same drug that amplify, that is a plasticity enhancer drug, then we have a larger, with high doses, we have a larger match between what's inside and what's outside, the mood and environment. And this is exactly what we found. This is, you can see here, a striking relationship. This is a striking relationship because it's 0.9 in biology. This is quite rare. And you can see that higher is the dosages of antidepressant they receive, higher is the match between how they feel and the life they have. So if they have a very favorable life, they feel very good. If they have a difficult life, they feel bad. I'm not an MD, so I don't give any medical advice here, so please be aware of that. This is very important because this is a very clear dose-relationship, dose-effect relationship, and overall there is no dose-effect relationship if we correlate the dose with the effect directly on mood. So this is something important. And this is something very general in pharmacology. You can see here for other drugs, ketamine, psychedelics, but even for oxytocin for autism, it's the same. You give oxytocin, okay, no effect, specific effect, but if you give oxytocin with a favorable environment, oxytocin amplifies plasticity, and so you see the effect. If it's not with a favorable environment, you see no effect or a worsening. So this is something important. Okay, now I will try to react to the first point, to the last talk by Sloot, and complexity in plasticity and plasticity, because he very elegantly showed how complex network, how to measure plasticity with in complex networks. What we have done is to try to measure plasticity with complex networks. How we did it? We considered, as people here in Amsterdam is doing very, very elegantly, like Danny Borsboom, what we did is to consider the symptoms of depression. Symptoms of depression is being anhedonic, so not feeling pleasure in activities usually associated with pleasure and so on. having depressive mood, suicidal thoughts, and so on. So these are the symptoms of depression. You can see here a graph, and you can see that the symptom number 3 is very much related to symptom number 1 and symptom number 2. What does it mean? It means that it always manifests with these other 2 symptoms. They go together. By contrast, symptom number 4 is more or less independent by all the others. This has an important implication. This is an important implication because if you want to change symptom number 3, you have to change also those symptoms that always go with that symptom. So you have to change 3 symptoms together to change symptom number 3. To change symptom number 4, you can just target that. And so it's much more easily molded, easily shaped, is much more plastic. So our idea is that when the connection between the nodes of a symptom network, for instance, is very strong, when the connection is very strong, plasticity is very low, because you have to change all symptoms at once. By contrast, if the connection between the different symptoms is weak, then you can much more easily change the entire system. This a very trivial example. I have a son who is 23 now, and he can eat 1 kilo of pasta, and 5 minutes after he can go running for 20K. Okay? If I do the same, I die. And this is why, the reason is because, unfortunately, my stomach and my heart are connected. And are strongly connected. So if I run with my stomach full of pasta, my heart will suffer from it. And such connection does not allow me to change my behavior. I cannot start running whatever I want. By contrast,
3 more minutes?
Sorry, yeah. By contrast, when he's running, his heart and his stomach are totally independent, and this allows him to start running whenever he wants. He's more plastic. So we tested this hypothesis. I will not go in detail. This is a work made by Claudia De Nicoli, who is in this room. And I will just show the results very briefly. Okay, I won't go. Okay, this is a graph in which you can see the network connectivity strength there. And this here is how much the patients improve in 4 weeks. So we measure network connectivity at baseline, so knowing nothing about patients, and then we followed them for 4 weeks and checked whether those that at baseline appear more plastic are more susceptible to change or not. And these are the results. So you can see that there is a strong correlation between having strong connectivity and low plasticity, and weak connectivity and high plasticity. Those that are highly connected are not plastic at all, and vice versa. Okay, so this is an example of measuring plasticity. This strategy, according to our perspective, is a way to say, okay, I have a plasticity level number it's 34. This person has 45, and this other person is 50. So we think this has a use. Is useful in clinical terms. So we hope that we can exploit that. Okay, so just 1 minute, just to reply to what Ray to Ray's input. I want to just to say that I fully share its perspective. Genes have a limited power in affecting our behavioral mental state. In order to say this, I want to show metaphors of the brain. Okay, metaphors of the brain went with the technology of the moment. So in the 18th century was the watch. Now it's the digital computer. The metaphor that I like very much to describe the relationship between genes, neurons, brain, behavior, and environment is this one. It's the kitchen. Okay, the kitchen. I think it's the best way to describe this. Why? What I show when I teach at the university, behavioral biology, I propose this metaphor. The metaphor is the following. The kitchen is the brain. All the ingredients and tools in the kitchen are the elements that you have in the brain. Neural pathways, genes, whatever. And then the output of the brain is the meal, that is behavior. And what I ask students is, what is the determinant of the meal? And it's a trick question. They immediately reply, okay, it's the ingredients you have in the refrigerator, for instance, that determine what is the meal. This is true, but they determine what is the meal, but don't drive what the meal will be, because there is a key element that is missing here. Is the context. The context drives behavior, and the context drives what you have to do. I'm speaking because you are here. If I would behave in the same way, but you were not here, it would be considered mental disorder. And the genes, what the genes do is that they allow me to speak. So the brain serves behavior, and the environment drives behavior, just to be in line with Venom. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so we have now 22 minutes for the discussion. I'm very happy that we had this session. I have a list of things that I wrote coming from the few speakers that we have, which will be sufficient for a couple of articles for our special issue. So I would be happy if the speaker can join us also. So Ray, have a seat. And it's yours. Anybody that wants to make the first comment and is brave enough, come on. Yeah.
Just to follow on.
Just a minute, the microphone, where is the microphone?
It's coming at 11.
Use it. Okay.
They can hear us.
I speak loudly.
They can hear us.
If Jeff says it's okay, it's okay.
Am I good, Yaron?
Maybe introduce
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, Frank Siebacher. Hi. I just wanted to follow on from your last comment, Igor, that also refers to Ray's comments. Hormones are very reactive to the environment, and they also are very deterministic for behavior. So you go out there, you get a big fright, your glucocorticoids kick in, you have a stress response, you do something, right? But all hormone pathways are determined by genes. So, and changes in gene expression and receptor sensitivities, which are proteins determined by genes, will be instrumental in that whole pathway. So I was just wondering, how do you place the sort of assertion that our behavior is independent from genes into that sort of endocrine context? Because there clearly is a role of those hormones in there, I think. I'm curious to hear your opinions on that.
Could I start? It's a very good question, I think. I think we often mistake faculty for facultative. I'm always impressed by the fact that in French there is a clear distinction between faculty and facultative. Facultative is that there's an option to do something. It's about the option. And when I move my arm, yes, I mean, there's a faculty of the arrangement of the muscles, and I've no doubt, and the strength of the muscles and various other things, and the skeleton and so on. It's a beautiful arrangement. When I move my fingers, it's really perhaps even more extraordinary, because I can move my fingers individually in all sorts of ways, and I can manipulate things with my fingers. But then, you see, I can play Beethoven. Actually, I can't. Or I can play Chopin. And these are choices. And I've not yet known a gene for Beethoven as a gene compared to a gene that causes me to play Chopin. And I think that the distinction between the maintenance of faculty, if you like, where genes are used in order to build and maintain, is different from what it is I actually do with my fingers.
I wonder if that's a little bit simplistic, because the way you feel at the time may make you play Beethoven or Chopin, right? And yes, you can, you have the faculty to do so. But the way you feel at the time may be totally determined by serotonin and dopamine.
That's true.
Depending on your context, and go back to the kitchen, if you have your son sitting there, you go, I don't have to put much effort into this because he just wants a kilo of pasta, right? You have a good friend who's a chef sitting there. You go, this makes me feel really good, all the endorphins coming through, and I go, I really have to create something good. So the context between the sort of social context and what you come up as a meal is dependent on the hormones in between. So you do have a connection there because those hormones are expressed via genes.
The distinction that I make is very much about the environment that both environment and genes both are determinants of behavior and mental state. However, what's below the behavior, what makes the organism determines what the organism can do, but not what the organism should do. This is what clearly what the organism can afford to do implies some limits. So I have to breathe because I have to stay alive. So this is an important consequence. But I think that the example you provided with cortisol is a very special example. There are few other pathways that are so well defined in physiology. And this is, there is a reason that, again, it's a contextual reason, in my view, and this is because cortisol is a lifesaver. And he has to be fast and lifesaver, and so this makes this pathway in particular very simple and effective. By contrast, most of the other pathways are not so clear-cut, and there is this phenomenon named multiple realizability, by which I can, going back to the kitchen metaphor, I can make a good primo piatto, Italian primo piatto, in so many ways to satisfy someone. Okay, so there are multiple ways to achieve my goal. But if there is one emergent urgent factor, then I have only few ways to do that. And cortisol is one example in this sense.
We have Anur. Just before that, the session over here was mainly focused on biology, and even Peter over here was stressing a biological system, even though he's working on other systems also. What I wanted to say is that people that don't have a biological background, don't stop yourself from intervening and talking about other aspects, or how do you see the connection to plasticity from your perspective to this biological session that we have. And we'll have Anur now.
Yeah, I'm Onur. I'm one of the members of the consortium. Thanks again for contributing to this. I have tons of questions, but I feel that we have to talk a bit about what we started to set at the very beginning, to try to make connection between different disciplines and definitions of plasticity. In this case, I noticed that you all talked about two things in particular. One of them is the mechanisms of plasticity, or in the case of Peter, even that the plasticity itself may be a mechanism for the complex system. And the second is limitations. I just would like to ask you if you could comment on the parallels that you see with other speakers or what was discussed here.
For instance, what you're
For instance, I see that if we had a very deterministic and strict system, it will be very hard to embed plasticity in it. Some randomness, so the stochasticity of the system, in a way enables it.
Yes.
But it doesn't, it's not a given that if you just have randomness, you will have plasticity, right? So,
I think one of the examples that was given is that, so if you have the example that you gave, that if you have a lot of connections, it actually stabilizes the whole system and it doesn't allow it to explore the whole phase space. But if you have much less connections and maybe weaker connections, it allows to explore different parts of the phase space. If you have yet more disconnection, it doesn't do anything anymore. So it is again this kind of operating on this edge of chaos, if you like, or whatever you want to call this. It is this transition from rigid to random. That's a nice one, where things seem to happen and where plasticity seems to happen. Because if things are completely disconnected, how you can talk about? Then there is no system. So how can you talk about plasticity of the system? If things are completely connected and rigid, there's nothing happening. So you need that kind of loosely connections, and we see that everywhere. You already mentioned the work of Danny Borsboom on depression symptom networks. It's the same. You see it everywhere. If the ties are too strong and too many, nothing is happening. If the ties are too weak, nothing is happening. It's really this kind of.
It does also ring bells with me. When I started out as a neuroscientist, I studied the somatosensory system, and the somatosensory system is extraordinarily complex. You've got so many different kinds of receptors to start with. And then if you look at the neurons, the function of the neurons that receive this input from this complexity of receptors, what one finds are systems that close things down. In other words, they start to manipulate. So receptive fields, for example, you could take one neuron and record it, and its receptive field under one circumstance would be so big. But under another circumstance of a stimulus occurring elsewhere, that receptive field will shrink. It's actually what I did my PhD on, was looking at the way in which inhibitory neurons can close down a certain amount of the, if you like, the sort of variability, the stochasticity. And for me, it was a little bit like shaping the system, so shaping the body, to try and locate where a stimulus was on the body. So initially, when you stimulate the body, the receptive fields are sort of, it's a very, talking very simplistically here, the sort of receptive fields are quite open. Now that appears to be quite true of the newborn, incidentally. They seem to be more open to input. And the central nervous system is not yet shaped, but it requires that sensory input to shape it. And in a sense, there's a certain point, I think there's a certain point where, because I'm fascinated by what you showed, Peter, that there's a certain point where the shaping is more variable, more easily done, and then of course there's a period of time when everything gets more hardwired. And once it becomes more hardwired, it gets somewhat less, not totally, but somewhat less plastic. And this is why those early years are so vital in education, because in those early years, this is being created in us humans. All those billions of synapses and billions of neurons are forming their connections in the first 20-odd plus years. It's a huge period of development that occurs after birth. And but initially, when you look at this in the somatosensory system, you see these massive receptive fields with huge amounts of input. You wonder whether the organism could possibly exist with all this information coming in. Then it goes through. Presumably, there might be a sweet point where it can be beautifully moldable, pliable, and moldable. And then, of course, there's a sort of deterioration as we become less plastic in old age, as it were, because we start losing the connections and the thing gets more rigidly hardwired.
I can
Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Carlos Fitzsimons. I'm a neurobiologist, so sorry to disrupt perhaps the discussion, but I have the feeling that we are moving towards almost accepting the definition that complexity and plasticity are linked. I'm not 100% convinced of that. Because if, for example, I take two neurons in a petri dish and I put them together, they will develop behaviors that I would call plastic. They would shape connections, they will morph their connections in between them, and they are only two neurons in the system. So I'm not 100% sure what we are calling complexity, because of course, if I start to dissect the neuron itself is a system that is very complex. So eventually, I think we would have to think what are we calling a system, and perhaps try to tackle the concept of the critical mass. How many of those units of a system we need in order to observe unpredictable change, right? But direct relationship in between complexity and plasticity, I'm not 100% sure of that.
So that's a good point. You can also, I don't think you can say that everything that shows plasticity is complex.
No.
But you can say that everything, I think you can say that everything which is complex
No, I
shows
agree with that.
plasticity.
So I'm actually asking about the null hypothesis that you
So the other way around, I don't believe you can say. I mean, we have a lot of material stuff that that show plasticity but are not complex. Not in the sense that they are adapting to the environment, blah blah, the whole thing that we were talking about. So it's a one-way really, causality or relation. So if it's complex, it shows plasticity. If it's plastic, it doesn't mean that it is
But
complex.
it's simply simple and simple
Yeah.
plasticity, right? So the two things are not directly in both ways.
It's not two-way, no.
Yeah, and Alice. So my background is in philosophy and the arts. So I wondered whether you consider these complex systems to be autopoietic in nature. So you talked about them as functioning as networks, and the question is whether all the elements should be internal to the system to make it evolve or not. I think that there are two very different ways of considering systems, whether in an autopoietic way and then you have a closed system, or in an alternative way, maybe a symbiotic way, I don't know, and then the system is open. And I think that plasticity resonates more with openness, but I'm not sure whether, I mean, it is a matter of boundaries. When an element starts interacting with the system, then does it get involved so much as to become part of the system, and then the system is closed again? I don't know, that's my question.
These are very, very good questions. So this whole point about open or closed is a long-standing discussion going on. And it's all very much on how you look at these things, right? So what we think from physics point of view, it should be open systems that actually show this plasticity, show this complexity, I should say. But then if you look at, let's say, the embryo development of a Drosophila, where you have this massive cascade of picoids and stuff like that interacts with each other and suddenly create this beautiful patterns, being the legs and the wings, etc. That in itself, if you look at it, you can look at it and that endogenousness and X from the X side. And so in itself, it can actually do all these things, but it does it in an environment. So it is, I think, the way we look at these things. It's how much we put things under a magnifier. And it's the same thing. So if you look too close, you miss what you're looking for, right?
Yes.
So I think in the end all these systems are open. But for us to reason about it, we sometimes just put a boundary around and say, okay, let's focus on this part. So it's an excellent question.
In a paper that we wrote about boundary conditions, we really got about conditions. And sometimes those conditions can change. And there are periods, you're absolutely right, I mean, there are periods when those boundaries become much more open to change. You referred to Drosophila, but it's also true of the human fetus. in the developing fetus, there's a much more openness of certain key ingredients to influence from the maternal environment. Part of this is anticipatory of the environment that the fetus is going to be born into. It has to prepare for the conditions metabolically, for example. And so there's an intimacy between the developing fetus, the placenta, the kind of placenta it's got, actually, and the maternal system and the environment. So this is a particular period. Another period that we know that the system might become more open in the genetic system, the genome, if you like, becomes more open, more susceptible to more readily pliable or changeable, is during adolescence. It's not a rigid system of compliance, if you see what I mean. That it's ebbing and flowing in terms of what it can. And it's one of the points that we try to make is that in itself is an adaptable process. So in face of stress, environmental conditions that stress a system, the system will open more to become more shapeable. I think terrible language, more easily shaped in response to it. And the sort of controversial thing that we put forward is that change can be then transmitted to the next generation, because it's rather like biological systems anticipating a future on the basis of the changes occurring now, which is one of the reasons why very rapid change is so extraordinarily difficult for us to cope with.
We'll take.
Just want to,
okay. 30 seconds, and then we'll take the last thing, and then we will finish. Yeah.
Okay, now just very briefly, just to reply to some comments. I think that a system can be identified by finding the interface. The interface is the place where the system interacts with the outer world. And for instance, and the interface has special powers, because the interface is a privileged level of control of the system. Because everything in the system has to be organized in order to interface work in a specific way. I'm talking now, my behavior is the interface between me, that I'm a system, with my environment. So everything within me has to be organized in order to allow me to talk now. So the interface is so critical in defining what a complex system is. And within the complex system, what I like so much about plasticity is the idea that it's, according to the way we measure plasticity, as the link among the different elements of the system, that plasticity is nowhere specific, in no specific place. Plasticity is distributed across the system, is everywhere in the complex system. So this is something that is important to me to highlight.
Okay, sorry, I'll take this one, and then.
My name is Patricia van der Haag. I come from a quite different background from all of you, I guess. I'm not a scientist. I work in practice on transformations of communities, so the socio-economic parts of transitions. And I'm trying to listen all what you're saying and trying to translate it to my way of working and viewing. And I am working on concepts like self-organization and concepts like I'm trying to find words and practice to make the factor labor dynamic. And I think we need a theme as plasticity. English is not my language. And I wonder very much if you could be able to move all your knowledge and all your speeches to the socio-economic parts and transitions that are needed in societies, in communities. When it comes to, I think what we need is we move, and I think we need a plastic way of thinking and to make that move from a top-down static way of government to polycentric government or distributed government, and dynamic labor and dynamic assets to make economy to do in the moment what is needed due to the more complex environment we live in due to climate change and all the social and economic problems you read in the newspaper. So I would like to invite you, if that's possible, to can you make a 1-minute pitch to change all your knowledge into themes as distributed governance or dynamic labor, so that when I wake up in the morning, I usually go to work from 9 to 5, then you're stuck in time, but you cannot move around and say, oh, we need to help all the elderly towards breakfast in my neighborhood, and then I go to work. Or when a heavy rainfall comes, oh, I do not go to work. First, I go do what is necessary in my environment, and then I go to work. To make labor dynamic in that way, that's what puzzles me. And well, maybe you can react to my work and my point of view from themes like self-organization, dynamic labor, polycentric government.
So 2 minutes to answer it, and then we'll take a break because we really need to move on. So yeah, the floor. And after that, the point is in the break, please continue the discussions.
So I suggest you read the book of Yaron, it was just published last week. Well, it's out, right? You know the book, right? So it's called Culture, Conflict, and Cooperation. And there should be a fourth C saying complexity. And it actually deals with this kind of thinking. And I think what the problem you're talking about is very much in line with the things we are talking about. It's very much the same. So
and if I could add to that, I mean, we are all niche creators, and we need to be niche creators. And I think you're absolutely right. A certain element of that participation in the niche creation in human life has been removed from individuals and local communities. And I think that this is a deficit in the capacity of people to make a change and difference in their lives, a distanciation from what is actually constraining their lives and the decisions that are being taken that impact them. And it has adverse consequences politically, because there's a tendency then for people to turn to more simplistic and dogmatic answers to what is happening to their lives, when really all they're wanting is to have at least some say in their immediate environment. The huge amounts of intelligence that is required to operate within a niche, within the ecosystem. But you see, that is reduced to some extent, or becomes less problematic when you are part of the creation of that information. So we've got to find a way of doing that. I don't know what the solution is exactly, because it's not...
That's my word.
But I like your question very much.
Igor, do you want to
Yeah, I can just highlight one point, that is, when we talk about plasticity in any field or discipline, this goes with a key concept, that is context. So if we want to pay attention to plasticity, we should pay attention also to context. Not only if it's good or bad, it's favorable or unfavorable, but also how fast it changes. So the rate of change in context, because these are key elements to understand whether plasticity, having a more plastic society, can be good or bad. So just
I think that a plastic society is rather disruptive.
it's right. I don't know. I think that Italians are much more plastic than Dutch people, and I think there are different ways of being.
Let's break it here. Please continue this discussion in the break over the coffee that is outside. What? 11:30 we are back in.